Welcome to an episode of Parliamentary Conversations of the Commonwealth, the CPA's podcast. We are thrilled to have with us Senator Crystal Drakes, a senator from the Barbados Senate. As well as being a politician, Senator Drakes is also an economist interested in sustainable development and environmental action. Crystal is also the co-founder of the Blue-Green Initiative Incorporated, a research-driven non-profit organisation aimed at executing sustainable projects in the Caribbean. Crystal has served in the Senate since 2018 and so has been part of a cohort of leaders that has overseen the transition of Barbados from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. Welcome, Senator Drakes.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the recent political and constitutional changes in Barbados, let's learn a bit more about yourself. You've had a rich and diverse career before entering politics, so if you could share with us just a bit more about your life before Parliament and then how you actually ended up becoming a senator.
So before entering into politics, I have a background in international development, worked for a number of development agencies, primarily in economic development across the region in the Caribbean, multiple countries, working on sustainable projects. And then in 2014, I transitioned from purely economic development to looking more at how the environment is incorporated into economic development policy, and that led me on a very long journey into sustainable development and how the economic paradigm for small island developing states needs to shift so that we become more sustainable as island countries. So before coming into Parliament, I was heavily involved in international development.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And you entered the Senate in 2018, which is right on the cusp of the sort of landmark changes we've seen over the last couple of years in Barbados, with the transition from constitutional monarchy to being a republic. And I just wanted to gauge your feelings around the transition. How did you feel during that period of serving as representative, and also just your own feelings towards monarchy and republicanism?
So we have a long-standing history as it relates to constitutional reform in Barbados. In the late 1990s, we had what was called the Ford Commission, which outlined a number of recommendations as it relates to parliamentary reform. One of those recommendations was the transition towards Republican status. So for me, it is a case of the country continuing the evolution of democracy for Barbados. And it is not necessarily that we are turning our backs on a constitutional monarchy, but it was very clear that the Prime Minister Motley, who was very clear on how we transition, it is a case of Barbados continuing a very deep, long-standing relationship with the United Kingdom, particularly England, but also establishing a new political and social identity for Barbados, becoming a republic. So I see a transition as something that has been long in coming, but the government of the day right now has the political will to take us over the line. And I believe that the engagement with the public will also continue, because we transitioned officially to a parliamentary republic in 2021, and we are awaiting a number of reports from our Constitutional Reform Commission and our Parliamentary Reform Commission. And I believe that those reports will continue to have public dialogue around what is this new type of democracy that we are ushering in the 21st century for Barbados.
So yeah, it's very much an ongoing transition.
Yes.
And I'm sure in the coming years there'll be a lot to learn from what's been happening in Barbados. And it's fascinating to watch because it hasn't happened for a while, especially in the Commonwealth. So this is maybe marking a new era for Commonwealth nations. But I wanted to speak more about the significance of the transition in Barbados. And for those who might fully understand the shift, What are some of the symbolic and practical changes that have come with moving from a monarchy to a republic?
So one of the major changes coming out of the transition, on November 30th, 2021, we conferred upon the Governor General at the time, who was the head of state, who was a representative of the Queen. We then moved to a president who was a national of Barbados. And we conferred upon Dame Sandra Mason being the president of Barbados. And I think that having a Barbadian as the head of state really signaled to the country that this is a shift in the way in which our political landscape will be changing. And I think that symbolism for us was significant as a society. Knowing now that we no longer had a representative of the Queen, but we now have in our own, one of our own, in Dame Sandra Mason, who is now the president of Barbados, that a Barbadian can be head of state and we can guide our own affairs in that regard.
Sure, that is a very important thing in terms of national identity as well. And you mentioned the 30th of November as that day of transition, which also I think is the Independence Day
Yes,
of
it
Barbados.
is.
Seems like a deliberate choice to coincide.
Yes.
I'm wondering, because that's sort of reignited a new sense of national identity and something to celebrate these coinciding events, the independence of Barbados as well as the transition to a republic, what that may have done to sense of national identity, national pride. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the transition to a parliamentary republic has brought up in public discussion is, who are we as a people outside of the post-colonial trappings and all that comes along with it. The question of national identity and how do we as a people confer and construct our own affairs as it relates to democracy, political representation, even things like our judiciary. There's a lot of public discussion now about how do we make the transition and what does that transition look like, and how do we effectively have a consensus around the Barbados of the 21st century, given the domestic objectives that we have, still taking into account the external factors of what's happening geopolitically as well. And I think that it is a healthy discussion for us to have, given the challenges that we are facing as it relates to things like climate change, and how we present ourselves to the world as a democracy and as a country that is taking a step towards self-identity in a modern world. And I think that is important. I think it is important for Barbadians and small island nations like ourselves to have a assessment of how we go about, one, advocating for ourselves on the global stage, as well as reinforcing who we are as a people.
So you mentioned this is an important transition moment, and there's also going to be lessons learned in the coming years. And I'm thinking about other countries around the world that are constitutional monarchies or monarchies in other forms, who might be considering a constitutional change. And what message do you think Barbados's experience says to those nations?
I think what it sends the message of the independence project is never over. You always, as a country, need these times of self-reflection on how your political structures are serving the needs of a population and a society. And I think it sends a message to other countries and other jurisdictions that the idea of independence, of sovereignty, is one that is a continuous evolving process. And it's not necessarily one that has both net negative or net positive, but seeing it as an evolutionary process that is supposed to fit the needs of a population and of a society. I think that's the message that it sends, because one of the things coming out of our transition is that it is clear that this is not a definitive point for us, but it is an ongoing process in terms of how we discuss matters of democracy in Barbados.
Yes, democracy, it's a living and breathing thing, isn't it? It's constantly
correct.
evolving and changing with the times. But yeah, brilliantly put. So that brings us to my final question for you. We're here in Sydney for the 67th CPC, and I just wanted to ask you about how you find these kind of events, these conferences, as a platform and a forum for Barbados and other small island nations to have their voice on the global stage, and how you're finding your experience here in Sydney at CPC.
I believe it's been a learning experience for myself. Having been in Parliament for the last 6 years, I always find it constructive to be at international conferences such as these, and seeing as well how smaller jurisdictions like Barbados and other Caribbean countries can influence the outcomes of some of these conferences is very encouraging. And I think it is a really good experience for members of Parliament to understand their obligation as visiting delegations to these types of conferences, to ensure that their concerns are being placed on the global agenda. For instance, CPC has done a fantastic job with its small branch program, and one of the things that I found heartening is the collection of ideas and lessons learned throughout this conference as it relates to the Small Branch Association. And we now have Honourable Valerie Woods being the newly elected chair of the Small Branches Network of the CPC. And I think that's a testimony to the support that smaller jurisdictions provide for each other in these types of fora.
Brilliant, yes. And any highlights for you over the last couple of days, either being in Sydney or at the CPC?
Highlights, I've only been here 2 days.
You need to go out and explore.
I know, I need to go out and explore. But I think one of the highlights was the election of Honourable Valerie Woods from Belize, who was the speaker in their government. But for me, it really was a moment of how the Caribbean rallies behind each other in these international spaces, because sometimes we're seen as separate, but these experiences remind us that we are one Caribbean, and the support is there as small island states.
Yes, the unity can be felt in the room.
Yes.
And with that brings us to a close. So, Senator Drakes, it's been a pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. You've shared some incredible insights about what's been happening in Barbados, about your own career and your experience here at CPC. So thank you for joining us for an episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth. For all listeners, you can tune in to this episode on Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you for joining us, and thank you again, Senator Drakes.
Thank you so much.